Our theme for 2020 is turning the world upside down. That phrase comes from a reference in Acts chapter 17, specifically in verse 6. And for background's sake, I would like to read beginning in verse 1 and notice why it was that people said that about Paul and the other Christians in that time period. In Acts chapter 17, verse 1, it says, "Now when they had traveled through Amphipolis and Apollonia, they came to Thessalonica, where there was a synagogue of the Jews. And according to Paul's custom, he went to them, and for 3 Sabbaths reasoned with them from the Scriptures, explaining and giving evidence that the Christ had to suffer and rise again from the dead, saying, 'This Jesus whom I am proclaiming to you is the Christ.' And some of them were persuaded." This is verse 4. "And they joined Paul and Silas along with a great multitude of the God-fearing Greeks and a number of the leading women. But the Jews," it says in verse 5, "becoming jealous and taking along some wicked men from the marketplace, formed a mob and set the city in an uproar. And coming upon the house of one Jason, they were seeking to bring them out to the people. When they didn't find them, they began dragging Jason and some of the brethren before the city authorities, shouting," and this is verse 6, they were shouting, "These men who have upset the world have come here also." Other translations say the phrase, "These men who have turned the world upside down." Now, I know that from their perspective, this was a bad thing. You've upset everything. You've turned everything upside down, the way things are meant to be, the way things should be, and you've ruined it all. But may it be said of us today that we've also turned the world upside down. That with boldness of speech, but with kindness, love, and persistence, we have also changed the people around us. We have turned their worlds upside down. Really, to turn the world upside down, we're not talking about some grand process. Turning the world upside down begins by you turning your own world upside down first. By changing your own preconceptions, your own prejudices even. By thinking of things in a different way. Thinking about God in a different way than you once did. Thinking about religion. Thinking about the Bible. Thinking about your enemies even in a different way than you once did. And once you've turned your world around, just move on to your neighbor and help turn his or her world upside down. And your family members and your co-workers, the people in your community. And bit by bit, soul by soul, we can turn the world upside down. I like it in a story, whether in a book or a movie, when the storyteller starts at the end and then by flashback goes back and says, "This is how we got to that point." I kind of want to do that today with you. Here in Acts chapter 17, I wonder what Paul was thinking. Everywhere he goes, he seems to turn the world upside down, and it doesn't work out very well for him. Paul goes from town to town, from city to city, from synagogue to synagogue, and at some point, Paul's got to be sitting there wondering, everywhere I go, people hate me. They malign me. They attack me. I have to be let out by a basket through the city wall just so I can escape from people who want to have me killed. There are people that want to stone me and beat me and whip me and imprison me and hand me over to the Romans. Everywhere I go, trouble just seems to follow. And I wonder in Acts chapter 17 if that same thought had crossed his mind. He's looking around and there's chaos in Thessalonica. There's a mob forming and they're screaming out, "These men who have turned the world upside down." And I just wonder in a moment of quiet if Paul was thinking, what brought me to this point? Well, that's what I want to look at today. If this is the end of the story, let's do a little flashback with Paul and find out what it was that brought him to this point. In Galatians chapter 1, beginning in verse 10, the Apostle Paul notes to the Galatians his former manner of life, the way that he once lived. We all know that Paul used to be called Saul of Tarsus. He says in Galatians 1 and verse 10, "For am I now seeking the favor of men or of God? Or am I striving to please men? If I were still trying to please men, I wouldn't be a bondservant of Christ. You get a little clue there about the way that Paul used to live when he was still Saul of Tarsus. The very fact that he says, am I still trying to please men? What's he implying there? That at one point in his life he was trying to please men. If I'm still trying to please men, right? Am I still trying to please men? What he's saying is, at one point, I was. That's what I was. I cared about what other people thought. I cared about getting ahead in my career. I cared about ingratiating myself to the right people at the right time in the right places in society. I cared what people thought about me. For I would have you know, brethren, he says in verse 11, that the gospel which was preached by me is not according to man. I neither received it from man nor was taught it, but I received it through a revelation of Jesus Christ. For he says in verse 13, you have heard of my former manner of life. My former manner of life in Judaism. How I used to persecute the church of God beyond measure. And I even tried to destroy it. He says in verse 14, I was advancing in Judaism beyond many of my contemporaries among my countrymen, being more extremely zealous, he says, for my ancestral traditions. Saul of Tarsus was the very definition of a rising star. He spent his formative years ingratiating himself to powerful men of the time. According to Philippians chapter 3, beginning in verse 1, he said, I had all the ethnic credentials that I needed. A Hebrew of Hebrews. I was educated. He was a pupil of the famous Gamaliel, according to Acts chapter 22 and verse 3. He sat by with an approving grin while Stephen was being stoned in the book of Acts, Acts chapter 7 and verse 58. He even offered to hold people's coats so that they could have the freedom of motion to really get that throwing motion on when they were stoning Stephen to death. And he led the charge against Christians in the very next chapter, in Acts chapter 9, beginning in verse 1. Or Acts chapter 8, beginning in verse 1. He was breathing threats and murders against Christians. In a sense, this guy had become like an enforcer for the leadership in Jerusalem. He was a rising star, well-educated, well-connected, well-taught, and he was willing to do anything you asked him as long as it helped his career. And killing Christians, chaining them up, imprisoning them, dragging them before religious tribunals, that is exactly what was helping his career the most. He was a man out trying to prove himself, building a resume, moving up in the world. And he found his blood-soaked path to fame. Noting it later on in Acts chapter 22, for example, where he has this to say. Reflecting on his former manner of life in Acts chapter 22, he said in verse 3, I am a Jew, born in Tarsus in Cilicia, brought up in the city, educated under Gamaliel, strictly according to the law of our fathers, being zealous for God just as you are all today. And I persecuted this way to death, binding and putting both men and women into prison. He says in Acts chapter 26, similarly, in verse 9, so then I thought to myself that I had to do many things hostile to the name of Jesus of Nazareth. And this is just what I did in Jerusalem. Not only did I lock up many of the saints in prisons, having received authority from the chief priests, but also when they were being put to death, I cast my vote against them. And as I punished them often in all the synagogues, I tried to force them to blaspheme, being furiously enraged at them. I kept pursuing them even to foreign cities. So at this point in Saul's life, if you had asked him what his future was going to look like, he would have offered a very well-laid plan. Essentially, Saul knew what his life was going to be. You know how people sometimes they have a 5-year plan, or you ask them, what do you want to do for a living? And they know exactly what they're going to do. And I want to go to this college and then get an internship here. And then finally when I have enough time, I'll do this, or I'll go here, or I'll travel. And they've got like a 5-year plan all laid out. Saul of Tarsus had his 5-year plan all laid out. And I don't think I'm overstating things when I say this. If he had followed his plan, if his plans had not been derailed by the story that we're about to read in Acts chapter 9, there is no telling how high up the ranks Saul would have climbed. surpassing perhaps even his own teacher Gamaliel. Maybe a sweet seat in the Sanhedrin council chambers? Who's to say how high Saul would have climbed? Who's to say how brightly his star would have shone? A lack of purpose or a drive to succeed was never Saul's problem. His life made sense to him. He loved the law, he loved his people, and Christians were an irritant, and they needed to be stopped. Was there ever a time in your life when you felt so sure of something, so certain that you were on the right path, and then suddenly you learned you weren't, and your world was turned upside down? And that's where we meet Saul, one day on the road to Damascus. Let's consider reading here in Acts chapter 9, beginning in verse 1. And for the rest of our lesson, we're going to go through the story that we are about to read. It says in verse 1, "Now Saul, still breathing threats and murder against the disciples of the Lord, went to the high priest. And he asked for letters from him to the synagogues at Damascus, so that if he found any belonging to the way, both men and women, he might bring them bound to Jerusalem." It says in verse 3, "And it came about that as he journeyed, he was approaching Damascus, and suddenly a light from heaven flashed around him. He fell to the ground, and he heard a voice saying, 'Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me?'" It's interesting, isn't it, how this voice is not saying, "Why are you persecuting Christians? Why are you persecuting them?" It says, "Why are you persecuting me?" I find it very comforting to know that Jesus takes it personally when I am being persecuted, when you are being persecuted. When Christians suffer for the name of Christ, He takes it personally. And I think that should be a word of comfort to us, because there's not a lot of other places to turn, right? If you were somebody living in the first century, whether you were a Jew or a Gentile, but in particular, we'll kind of keep it within the context of Acts chapter 9, but if you were a Christian who had converted from Judaism, so you were a person, you were born Jewish, ethnically Jewish, you had been raised in that environment, always knowing something, always looking at life from a certain preconceived point of view, and you became a Christian. Well, you're not welcome with any of your Jewish friends any longer. In fact, you may even feel outright alienation from them in your community. They won't patronize your business any longer. They won't let their kids marry your kids any longer. So there is social, there is economic, there is political isolation being felt. Now, you don't feel welcome with the Gentiles either, because all the things that made you uncomfortable about the Gentiles before, their heathenish ways, their religious practices, their immorality, all that stuff still exists. And so here you are now, a Jewish Christian. You have nowhere to go, nobody who welcomes you, nobody who cares about what happens to you, except for God. And when people like Saul of Tarsus show up, looking to ruin your life, looking to drag you in chains, looking to persecute you and harm you and malign you just because you believe in the name of Christ, you know who's just as hurt as you are? Jesus. He takes it personally when His people are harmed. And so in verse 5, Saul said, "Who art thou, Lord?" And he said, "I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting." Wait, I thought this Jesus of Nazareth guy was dead. I thought this whole resurrection thing was a myth. I thought it was just a myth that His followers were kind of pushing upon people, trying to convince us that Jesus came back from the life, or came back from the dead. And now this Jesus is before me, accusing me. I am Jesus whom you are persecuting. But rise and enter the city, and it shall be told you what you must do. Not what you should do, what, a good idea or a nice suggestion, but it will be told you what you must do. All right. So in verse 7, the men who traveled with him, they stood there speechless. They heard the voice, but they saw no one. And Saul got up from the ground, and in verse 8, though his eyes were open, he could see nothing. And leading him by the hand, they brought him into Damascus. And he was 3 days without sight, and neither ate nor drank. Yeah, that's maybe a detail that's kind of easy to glaze over and move on in the story. Let's think about this for a second. 3 days without sight. 3 days, we might say, to sit and stew. I've always liked that phrase, by the way. That's one of my favorite old phrases. 3 days to sit and stew. 3 days to sit there blind and think about what you had done. What's interesting about this is that Jesus gives him this time. And I think for his own benefit. Because he has to sit there and really ponder, really process what it is that he had been doing with his life. I think it's very easy in the heat of the moment to make changes, sweeping changes to your life, to say that you believe one thing or say that you'll change in some way. And I suppose in the heat of that moment, if Jesus struck him blind, giant, bright light, voice from the heavens and said, right now, go get baptized, you got to be a Christian now, probably out of nothing but fear and shock, Saul would have gotten baptized. But instead, Jesus says, go to the city and think for a little while. Think for a little while about what you've done. Not because Jesus is trying to rub it in or anything like that, pour salt in the wound and really make him feel guilty about things. But I do think that in the process of becoming a Christian, we do have to have the time to process what we've done with our life up until that point. You have to honestly and soberly assess the kind of life that you've lived up to that point. And Saul needed that time. Saul needed that time. And so, he allows him to sit there blind for 3 days, fasting, starving himself, neither eating nor drinking. 3 days he's allowed to sit there and stew. Good. Because it's what he needed. Now, verse 10. There was a certain disciple at Damascus named Ananias. The Lord said to him in a vision, Ananias. And he said, behold, here I am, Lord. Harkens back to Isaiah when he was first called as a prophet, right? Here I am, Lord, send me. And the Lord said to him in verse 11, arise and go to the street called Straight, which is in the photograph on the screen here. And you can still go to the street called Straight, by the way, in modern day Damascus. That's an older photograph, obviously, but you can still go to the street called Straight. You could look it up, Google it. There's a number of pictures online. Go to the street called Straight and inquire at the house of Judas for a man from Tarsus named Saul. For behold, he is praying. And he's seen in a vision a man named Ananias come in and lay his hands on him so that he might regain his sight. But Ananias answered, Lord, just one little thing. I don't know if you'd heard or not. I've heard from many about this man, this Saul of Tarsus. How much harm he did to thy saints at Jerusalem. And here he even has authority from the chief priest to bind all who call upon thy name. Lord, we're talking about the same Saul, right? Saul is a fairly common name. I mean, we get Saul mixed up. I mean, we're talking about the same Saul, are we? What I like about this, God doesn't see us the way other people see us. You know, when Ananias looked at Saul of Tarsus, what did he see? He saw a wicked man, an evil man, a persecutor of the church. He saw a man that needed to be punished. He saw a man that needed the full wrath of God brought down upon him. That's what Ananias saw. Now, I'm not saying Ananias is exceptional in any case. He's not exceptional in his attitude towards Saul because we're all a lot like him. We tend to judge based on the exterior, the superficial. We judge people based on what they have done, not on what they're capable of doing or what they're capable of being. So I'm not saying I'm any better than Ananias. I think if God had come to me and told me the same thing, I probably would have responded just like Ananias. Jesus, Lord, I know you're Lord, I get that. Have you been reading the news a lot lately, though? Are you aware of what this Saul of Tarsus is busy doing right now? How he's come to Damascus not to learn the way of the truth. He's come to Damascus to try and destroy the way of the truth. And so all Ananias saw was what Saul was. What Jesus sees is what Saul can become. And thank the Lord that He sees that same potential in all of us. There are people in this life who just know too much about me. You know what I mean? There's people in this life, they just know too much about me. And maybe they were there during a part of my life where I'm not very proud of it. Where I didn't behave the way I should. Where I said something I shouldn't have said. I lived a certain way that I shouldn't have lived. I burned bridges when I shouldn't have. But what Jesus sees is what I can become, not what I've been. And so he goes on to explain in verse 15. Go, for he is a chosen instrument of mine to bear my name before the Gentiles and kings and the sons of Israel. For I will show him how much he must suffer for my name's sake. All right, so why do Christians suffer? Why do good people suffer? What is the point? What is the meaning of suffering? To me, this is a very telling verse. And I'll put it this way. Sometimes the meaning of life is to suffer. Sometimes that is the point. You could go to another passage like Hebrews chapter 5, for example, where it says that Jesus had to suffer so that he could learn obedience in the things in which he suffered. Or James chapter 1. What's the point of suffering? What's the point of pain and sorrow? It's so that we can learn endurance. And so that endurance can have its perfect result, that we may be perfect and complete, lacking in nothing. Sometimes the meaning of life is to suffer. And so we may shake our fists up at God and say, why, God? Why all the suffering? Why do good people suffer? Why does Job suffer? Why does Saul suffer? Why do the apostles suffer? Jesus says here, I'm going to show him how much he'll suffer for my name's sake. And by the way, I think it could be easy to read that as kind of vindictive, right? That may, on the surface, seem like kind of a vindictive thing. Oh, I'm going to show him how much he's going to suffer, and I'm really going to make him suffer. I'm going to really dig the heel in on that one. And, ooh, that Saul, he was persecuting Christians, and he's going to spend the rest of his life being persecuted now, and I'll show him a thing or two. I don't think that's the attitude that's going on here. Saul is being given a chance to see what is truly life. What the real point of this life is. Because remember, up until this point, Saul, in his own words, said, I want to be a man pleaser. I'm trying to please people. I'm trying to ingratiate myself. I'm trying to move up in the world. I'm trying to become a Jew of Jews and a Hebrew of Hebrews. And I want to be a Pharisee. And I want a seat on the Sanhedrin Council. I want it all. And if he kept following that path, he would have had quite the nice earthly existence. Until 70 AD, that is. Now, I don't want to speak too far here, because you never know how someone's life might have turned out if they weren't a Christian. Like, we're not given that chance to see an alternate version of yourself and what life would have been like. But let's just say, just for the fun of it, let's say Jesus had not intervened here. Or, at the very least, if Saul of Tarsus had not chosen to obey. And he kept going. Now, he probably would have had a pretty good life. Because he would have kept moving up. One more rung on the ladder, another rung on the ladder, another rung on the ladder. Maybe he would have surpassed Gamaliel. Maybe he would have had that seat on the Sanhedrin Council. And he would have been a head Pharisee. He would have been of the ruling class, part of the elite. He had built his career on persecuting and destroying, and people loved him for it. And you know where Saul of Tarsus would have been in 70 A.D.? Cloistered in the city of Jerusalem, surrounded by the Roman army. And he would have been killed. So it's interesting. Now, I know that's just purely hypothetical. I get that. But he traded one kind of suffering for another. The only difference is, if he'd thrown his lot in there in Jerusalem and said, I want to see this through to the end. I'm going to be a zealot. I'm going to be a fighter. That would have resulted in nothing for him, eternally speaking. So yeah, he was beaten a few times and stoned a few times and received lashes, and he was whipped and he was shipwrecked and spent a night and a day on the deep. And I get all that. But Paul looks at his life in the rearview mirror and says, I ran a race. I fought a good fight. I finished a course. I suffered a great deal. And I don't regret it. So we keep reading here in Acts chapter 9 of the kind of person that Saul becomes. He ends up receiving the gospel here beginning in verse 17. Brother Saul, he says, this is Ananias, the Lord Jesus who appeared to you on the road by which you were coming, He sent me so that you may regain your sight and be filled with the Holy Spirit. And immediately there fell from his eyes something like scales. He regained his sight and he arose and was baptized. And he took food and was strengthened. Now for several days he was with disciples who were at Damascus in verse 19. And immediately he began to proclaim Jesus in the synagogue, saying, He is the Son of God. One who once wanted to destroy the way of Christ is now proclaiming the way of Christ and shocking everybody. And all those who were hearing him in verse 21 continued to be amazed. They were saying, Is this not he who in Jerusalem destroyed those who called on this name, and who had come here for the purpose of bringing them bound before the chief priests? But Saul kept increasing in strength and confounding the Jews who lived at Damascus by proving that this Jesus is the Christ. And it was that decision in Damascus that set in motion the rest of his life. And it wasn't long after that where the only escape that he had was to be lowered in a basket through a window in the city wall because people wanted to kill him. And that wasn't the last time that was going to happen to him. And it wouldn't be the last time that people would hate him and persecute him and malign him. And it wouldn't be the last time that people were shocked that this Saul of Tarsus has now become Paul the Apostle of Jesus Christ. But my friends, Saul had his life turned upside down. Or rather, he had his life turned right side up. Because that's kind of the ironic twist to all of this, isn't it? Our theme for 2020 is turning the world upside down. But in reality, we're not turning anything upside down when we preach people the gospel. What we're really doing is turning the world right side up. Because the way of Jesus is always the right way. And the light of God has always been the right way. And the path to heaven has always been the right way. The one who was upside down was Saul of Tarsus. And it was on that fateful day on the road to Damascus that for the first time in his life, instead of nothing but darkness before his eyes, he finally saw the light of God and was turned right side